recognize, and I think Manisha's insistence on a kind of different chronology is important, is that the democratic projects that we associate with Reconstruction did not all end in the 1870s. In many parts of the South, especially in areas where there was not a robust Reconstruction, Texas, Virginia, there is a real important pulses of democratic activity in the 1870s and into the 1880s. We also have to remind ourselves that labor radicalism of the 1880s and populism in the 1890s tried to take that democratic project further, and that in some ways, we have a better idea of understanding the way in which Northern and Southern elites kind of joined hands in the task of repression, precisely because the labor question was staring all of them in the face. And the prospect of a different kind of political economy, a different kind of democracy, a form of social democracy, endures. And, if you think about white Southerners, they often think about the end of Reconstruction coming with disfranchisement in the late 1890s and the early first decade of the 20th century. So again, it raises the question of what is a good chronology of Reconstruction. I think Manisha takes it further, and that should be part of our discussion and debate too. But we need to remind ourselves that there's a pretty long, a sort of thread of democratic struggle that is going on even past what we ordinarily see as the period of Reconstruction.
Yeah, I would like to reiterate that point because Steve's absolutely right. In Virginia and in North Carolina, particularly, you have these fusion governments with white populists and Black Republicans in the 1890s, even in Tennessee, and sometimes even in the deep South states at the local level, the populists are presenting a real challenge to reviving some of those notions of state activism, of having a progressive and contest. They even won direct elections of the president, which was a good idea. And that sub-treasury plan, which is a plan that where the government would basically give credit directly to farmers to bypass middlemen, especially bankers and railroads. And I think there was, again, if you look at the way white elites in the South react, it's through sheer terror and violence. So if you look at the Wilmington Massacre of 1898, I mean, it replicates, because they see it as a real threat, because these guys politically are really, and I'm thinking back to Steve's first book.
I end Illiberal America with a really dramatic local case in a county in Texas where a more than 2-decade experience of biracial politics that managed to endure all sorts of efforts to undermine them, even when they were populist at one point, even when the Populist Party went down to defeat nationally and even in the state of Texas, they endured. And it only ended when the White Man's Union was organized in 1900, and they gunned down the whole populist leadership, beginning with the Black leaders. So I think it goes with Manisha's idea about the fall of the Second Republic, and it was a fall and it was a crushing, and that's important for us to recognize.
Thank you so much for that, Steve. And Manisha, one thing I do want to make sure that we bring in before the end here, Manisha Sinha, is your fascinating chapter on the conquest of the West, and sort of how that part of the story fits into the broader story of Reconstruction you're telling from 1860 to 1920. Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of the relationship between what we find in the slow collapse of Southern Reconstruction and sort of the rise of, whatever you want to call it, a reconstruction of the West, or however you want to characterize it, or conquest of the West, as you do?
Yes, just as I say that Reconstruction history is women's history, we can't afford to ignore Native American and Western history while talking about the history of Reconstruction. And Western historians have come up with this notion of the Greater Reconstruction, where they talk about the expansion of the nation state, the reconstruction of the South, and the reconstruction of the West as similar processes, a consolidation of the nation state. And they want to go right back to the Mexican War and end in 1877 in this sort of greater reconstruction of the West. I disagree a little bit with that thesis. I think it's important to look at that, but I argue in my book that if you look at dispossession, then you would have to begin with the founding of the first American Republic, which is pretty much founded on the dispossession of Native Americans. That can't be the criteria. What I was really interested in is looking at the Indian Wars in the West. And what struck me, especially with my own education growing up in India, is how much they smacked of colonial warfare. This was no Lincoln's Code, no inquiries into massacres, etc., that happened during the Civil War. This was brutal warfare against even the civilian population, very much like colonial warfare. So there are historians who see the Indian Wars as merely an extension of the Civil War. I say these are very different political projects. And I look at the conquest of the West more in the sense of the unwinding of Southern Reconstruction, because it is true that the very same Union Army regiments, the 7th Cavalry, for instance, being used to enforce Black rights in the South are precisely the ones that are being sent first to, fire at strikers, but also to fight these Indian wars. And that it's really in the late 19th century, not just with the Dawes Act, which sort of subdivides Indian land into homesteads and results in a massive dispossession, but also just in terms of the violence against these Indian nations, the warfare against Indians, that dispossession actually increases rapidly well after 1877. It's really in the 1890s, or even if you look at something as iconic as the Wounded Knee Massacre, I talk of many other massacres. And what struck me was this kind of colonial project of not just conquering these lands and dispossessing Native Americans, but also of forcible assimilation, which was very common by European colonial powers in Asia and Africa at the same time. This is the height of European imperialism, the scramble for Africa. So I saw it more through those lens. And I also saw it as a sort of stepping off point for American warfare in the Pacific with the 1898 Spanish-Cuban American War, with the acquisition or the annexation of Hawaii and Puerto Rico, the colonization of the Philippines. What struck me were not the Civil War generals, who are not there much. The Sherman does go to England to learn rules of colonial warfare before he comes back to head the Department of Missouri. But Sherman and Sheridan interested me less. There are others like Nelson, Miles, etc., who see warfare in the West and who earn their spurs there. And they're the ones who end up in, Puerto Rico, in Philippines, in Cuba, because they are adept at this kind of colonial warfare. And the fact that the United States Supreme Court then actually issues these insular decisions that says these conquered territories are outside the purview of the 14th Amendment, outside the citizenship rights of the 14th Amendment, was important for me too, because suddenly you have this colonial relationship where the plenary powers of the federal government, unrestrained by the US Constitution, are then being exercised in these areas. And that's why I talk about it as going from republic to
Well,
empire.
one of the things I would say as somebody who is a little more sympathetic to looking at the West and South as part of a larger Reconstruction project is to remember that the South, the post-Civil War South, was oftentimes viewed as a kind of economic colony of the Northeast. There was clearly an idea, there was martial law that was imposed, the expansion of federal power there and in the West in different ways. But I think Manish is right. I think, looking at the West in this period is a colonial project, and in many ways so is the South. And it is a springboard because the soldiers who were fighting Indian wars in the West end up in the Philippines with people like Nelson Miles, who also spent time putting down labor unrest in the early 1890s. in the United States.
Excellent. And Stephen, one other, part of the Western story that both you and Manisha focus on is also just, and it connects to your story of illiberalism, is this strain of anti-Chinese sentiment throughout so many states, especially out west. You talk a bit about the policies that emerge from that sentiment and also just the violence that we see during this period.
Well, I mean, this is, again, part of the story of the 19th century going back into the early period, the marking of Chinese men mostly, but women to some extent, as over the borderline of humanity and decency, and therefore subject to whatever sort of retribution might be meted out to them. Anti-Chinese violence is just horrific. In the latter half of the 19th century, both before and after the Chinese Exclusion Act of the early 1880s. And this is, it's important for us to recognize that anti-Chinese sentiment and violence, it has a bipartisan character to it. And even, it crosses over people like Henry George, who, in other ways, is an important exponent of the anti-monopoly tradition and of labor radicalism, was himself an advocate of Chinese exclusion and hostility. So I think that's really, an important thread that runs through a lot of U.S. history. I mean, Chinese were not Christian. They were not white people. They were from an area of the world that was not known. In so many ways, they kind of fit into the crosshairs of illiberalism, both at the grassroots and at the top.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the tragedies of the labor movement in the West, is how much they buy this, the working men's party, right, that buys into a lot of this anti-Chinese sentiment, and it's under the guise of coolie labor, undermining the wages of, quote, Native American labor.
Right, it's using anti-slavery rhetoric.
Exactly. I mean, it begins as kind of a democratic project in California, but is quickly co-opted by the Republicans, and you get the Chinese Exclusion Act. But I see this all as part of this sort of imperial framework of seeing the Chinese as so foreign and unassimilable that, there was even the progressives of that time found it difficult. And I think that's one of the tragedies of the fall of Reconstruction. You see it in the suffrage movement, you see it in the labor movement, you see it in the progressive movement itself, is that once that project of the interracial democracy is gone, the language that even progressives are sometimes using are racially exclusionary and loaded. And that I think is one of the biggest tragedies of the overthrow of American Reconstruction.
Thank you for that, Manisha. Maybe one final question to you, Manisha Sinha, and to end on the same note you end your book on, which is the idea of the 19th Amendment as the last Reconstruction Amendment. Can you talk a little bit about your choice there and why, that's where you decided to end the story of the Second Amendment, the fall, the rise and then fall of the Second American Republic?
Yes, I wanted to explore this idea of progressive constitutionalism. There are a number of questions that you've gotten from your audience about the Constitution, the role of the Constitution, and we are all worried today about, what are some of the fixes that we can put that would prevent, for instance, the tyranny of a minority. You've had a strong constitutional thought going right back to Calhoun that talked about citizenship as an exclusionary idea. And what's interesting about Reconstruction is this notion that you can amend the Constitution. Of course, it was easy to do that because much of the southern states were not part of the Union when the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are passed. In fact, the 14th Amendment is a condition of their readmission into the Union. And I think it's one of the reasons why a lot of conservatives still today question the constitutionality, believe it or not, of the 14th Amendment. So I think this idea of progressive constitutionalism was an important legacy of Reconstruction. It's what the suffragists ran with. Initially, the idea was to have a 16th Amendment that would give women the right to vote. Unfortunately, the suffrage movement does divide over the issue of the 15th Amendment. A lot of suffragists, especially Stanton and Anthony in a more expedient way, are pretty elitist. And Stanton clearly says, why should I, not an educated daughter of the Republic, have the right to vote when you're giving the right to vote to